When Breath of the Wild first released in 2017, it was met with almost universal acclaim from fans and critics alike. It represented both a big departure but also a return to form for the series. Together with the release of Mario Odyssey later the same year, it seemed to also mark a turning point for Nintendo, as both titles were succeeding installments in their respective franchises that were criticized by some fans for playing things too safe. It seemed Nintendo was back to taking risks to reach ambitious goals. Not all risks pay off, however, and one of the areas of Breath of the Wild that was generally considered subpar was its story. The general consensus was that it left something to be desired, not necessarily for any faults in the writing, but mostly for its lack of presence throughout most of the adventure. For a while, I used to share this sentiment, but after replaying the game a couple of times, I think I've realized some really interesting aspects of the narrative, particularly in the way the plot relates to the game's development and gameplay. It elevated my opinion so much that I now think it might be one of the best integrations between narrative and gameplay the series has done since Majora's Mask, which is itself a topic for a future video. In this analysis, I hope to present some arguments that might give you a better appreciation of the game's plot and how its themes relate to its gameplay. To do that, we'll go through how and why the game breaks from series tradition, how that break affected its aesthetics, and finally, how that relates to its gameplay. As always, this video will contain spoilers and is better understood if you've played the game, so you've been warned. In 2011, when Skyward Sword first released, it was met with the usual fanfare from fans and critics, but as hype faded, many started noticing its more problematic aspects. The game's excessive handholding, coupled with segmented areas and overly strict adherence to the traditions of past Zelda games, made the experience a bit of a drag for some. While by no means a series newcomer, this was Hidemaru Fujibayashi's first time directing the next big 3D Zelda game. The same way Eiji Aonuma once stepped up to the role of director as Miyamoto moved on to a producer role, so too was Fujibayashi following in those footsteps back in 2011. I mentioned all of this because I think it's fascinating that the same man who directed Breath of the Wild directed Skyward Sword. Even while we can see the embryos of some of Breath of the Wild's ideas in Skyward Sword's stamina bar, equipment crafting, light beacons, and so on, they each still represent vastly different ideas of what Zelda should be. So what is Zelda's identity? Based on the first Zelda for the NES, you would think it's all about exploration, but the series has grown increasingly linear ever since that first game, to the point where it might be hard to argue this is what Zelda is. In a talk at GDC 2017, Fujibayashi stated that he wanted the next Zelda game to provide players with an unparalleled sense of freedom in an open playfield, with the objective that players would experience a new sense of adventure again and again. To accomplish this, he used two guiding principles: rediscovering the essence and breaking conventions. Rediscovering the essence of Zelda meant going back to that first game in the franchise. A game that was, due in part to the limitation of the hardware, unencumbered by a linear story for the player to follow, and as a result, each new screen the player ventured into felt like a new discovery. Meanwhile, breaking conventions meant reinventing or even outright abandoning some of the ideas that have come to be known as staples of the series in its, at the time, 36 years of history. These two approaches may seem like polar opposites, but they share one similarity that ended up being core to the story told in the game itself. Both deal with the weight of Zelda's past and legacy. whether intentionally or not, this theme also permeates the events told within the world of Breath of the Wild. All 4 major regions where the divine beasts reside showcase story beats related to the events of 100 years ago, as well as the expectations set upon the new champions in relation to their respective predecessors. Yunobo in particular illustrates this really well. His cowardly personality is not only the polar opposite to Daruk's easygoing demeanor, but a subversion of what one would expect from the new champion of a race of rock people. Even his name, Yunobo, feels less imposing than the names of other important Gorons in the series, such as Darunia, Darmani, Patriarch Darbus, and so on. Despite that, after freeing Daruk's spirit from Varudonia, the Goron champion is seen worrying about the state of his tribe after 100 years of his defeat. It's only once he spots Yunobo, his descendant, that he feels reassured the Gorons are in good hands. Daruk embraces the new generation despite their differences. This flexibility in the face of tradition is also seen in Riju. Through her diary, we come to find she is insecure about being too young to be the chief, and she fears her people might feel the same way. But her age might also be what allows her to bend the rules of the Gerudo and allow Link to travel within the walls of the town while in disguise. This willingness to rethink tradition is what ends up allowing her to recover the Thunder Helm and appease Vanaboris. Urbosa's relationship to her tribe's past is also showcased when she calls out Ganondorf as a stain in their history. It's a small moment, but it does hint at the dark side of legacy. The Zoras are another great example of the game's association between old age and tradition versus youth and rethinking conventions. Thanks to their prolonged lifespans, many of the older Zoras were alive 100 years ago and still resent Link for taking Mipha along on his journey and getting her killed. To contrast that, a lot of the younger adults remember Link fondly as they were just kids at the time before the calamity struck. The theme of tradition also comes into play as the Zora armor Mipha made for Link is revealed. Muzu's adherence to the Zora's past and tradition blinds him to the truth. Meanwhile, Mipha threads a thin line between following marital customs and breaking conventions by falling in love with a Hylian. She accepts the past but adapts it to her current situation. We can start to see why I drew a parallel between the game's plot and its development. Almost everywhere we can see the characters in Breath of the Wild dealing with the past and the expectations set by those who came before, but nowhere is this more true or relevant than in Zelda herself. By collecting the various memories scattered throughout Hyrule, players can witness snippets of what Zelda's journey was in the years leading up to the calamity, and her story is one of constant failure in the face of expectations placed upon her. All women of the royal family before her had awakened the sealing power of the goddess Hylia. It's a tradition that, if we're to believe the Zelda timeline, at this point goes back through millennia. When faced with this failure to meet expectations, she turns to a different method of trying to stop the return of Ganon, through the research of ancient Sheikah technology. However, we see this as something the king himself scolds her for, claiming it distracts her from her true purpose. The idea of a person's purpose being defined at birth exemplifies the pressure exerted by others' expectations. Nowhere is this made more evident than in the 7th memory cutscene, Shelter from the Storm. In it, we see Zelda questioning Link's desire to follow in his father's footsteps as a knight of the Royal Guard. With the full picture of the game's plot in mind, it seems obvious that Zelda is projecting her insecurities onto Link in this scene. With the line, "Would you have chosen a different path?" it's made clear that the quest for identity is a theme closely related to the characters' attitudes towards those who came before and the expectations they set. We'll dive deeper into it when we talk about the gameplay, but it's important to keep in mind how the theme of breaking conventions naturally leads to the idea of freedom to craft your own identity. One other interesting thing to note is that in every past Zelda game, Link has always been naturally gifted either as a swordsman or as an archer or demolitions expert, musician, Beyblade master, you name it. This is a natural consequence of the series progression system being tied to the acquisition of new items. For the player, using an item is as easy as pressing a button, so naturally, Link is as skillful as the player makes him. But never before was this aptitude used as a plot point like in this cutscene. Here, Link is set up as a foil to Zelda's inability to play the role that's expected of her. She wants to be a researcher, but she has to be the princess instead. All of this is well and good, but you might be asking, isn't King Rhoam ultimately proven right? The Guardians turn out to be easily corrupted, and it's only the sealing power of the goddess that keeps Hyrule from falling into complete ruin. It's easy to draw the conclusion that, in the end, Zelda should have focused more on awakening her power and less on researching Sheikah technology. Honestly, I'm almost tempted to concede and call this a flaw in the storytelling. There are plot elements that can be interpreted to go against this reading of the events, but if I may put on my critic hat for a moment, there should have been an explicit, inarguable refutation of the idea that Zelda was wrong to focus on her research, and the fact that this isn't present is by far Breath of the Wild's biggest storytelling failure in my eyes. That being said, as I just stated, there are elements in the game's text that we can point towards to defend Zelda's desire to find alternative methods of fighting Ganon. First is how the game itself portrays King Rhoam. In the memory where he prohibits Zelda from aiding in the Guardian's research to focus on her training instead, it's evident that we're meant to empathize with her. He's portrayed as a cold, uncaring father who's more concerned about gossip mongers than the well-being of his daughter. Through the King's journal, we come to know he does care a great deal about Zelda. The last entry in particular is especially interesting since Rhoam concedes that maybe through her research she will stumble upon the answers she needs. This is the closest we come to an implication that Zelda's research could have somehow prevented the corruption of the Guardians. Speaking of which, her research also uncovered the Shrine of Resurrection, which ended up being another essential tool to stop Calamity Ganon given how the events of the story played out. The kingdom may have fallen 100 years ago, but in some ways her research also played a crucial role in giving Hyrule a second chance. Another point against the king's behavior is that even when Zelda's power does manifest, it's not because of her dedication to her training or her prayers at the statues of the goddess, but instead it's because of her feelings towards Link. Mipha does imply that she harnesses power from her love of Link when using her healing magic, so it seems like these abilities are tied to emotions. The logical conclusion is that Zelda's power would have never unlocked by training. She needed to develop naturally, like the not so subtly named Silent Princess flower, which only blossoms in the wild. The dichotomy of Zelda's complicated relationship with her legacy and the importance it plays in saving her kingdom feels to me directly tied to the efforts of the development team to come up with a new direction for the series while being respectful to its history. This ambiguity permeates a lot of the elements that make up Breath of the Wild and, unsurprisingly, can be easily seen in another controversial aspect of the game: its music. Much like the game's plot, the music in Breath of the Wild also saw criticism from fans for its minimalist approach. This opinion does seem to have shifted more favorably as the years went by, and nowadays I feel like most fans see this game's soundtrack as a worthy, albeit different, entry in the series. Even at a surface level, it's easy to draw the conclusion that this difference seems to be another way in which Breath of the Wild sought to break Zelda conventions. Which I think is a fair statement, but there are also interesting ways in which the songs retain a lot of traditional elements from past Zelda soundtracks, not only in how they are composed, but also in how they are tied to specific kinds of spaces in the game world. I am not an expert on music or music theory for that matter, so a lot of the basis for my arguments going forward will be drawn from a YouTube video by YouTuber pixeltea titled Less is More, an analysis of the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild's soundtrack. The link for it will be in the description and I highly recommend you watch it, it's a great video. In it, pixeltea explains that the more traditional Zelda songs can be classified as romantic music, which favors grandiose arrangements and more memorable melodies, such as this. Or this. Meanwhile, Breath of the Wild's soundtrack leans more heavily towards impressionist music, where the intent is to present an atmospheric, emotional texture rather than hummable tunes. Think about how the piano punctuates arriving at the desolate Lanayru promenade. Or the galloping rhythm of riding a horse. Or the chaotic cacophony of the battle music. The new style stands out in contrast to other OSTs in the franchise, and as such, there's a tendency to think this is the full extent of what Breath of the Wild's music sounds like. However, it's important to note that these are actually not the only kind of music players will hear on their journey. Specifically, town themes lean much more heavily towards the traditional romantic compositions of past Zelda games, creating a heavy contrast against the soundscape of the wilderness. What that means is that the two primary music styles of the game have a strong association with their geographical location. Romanticism is associated with the game's towns, which in and of themselves are much more aligned with traditional Zelda gameplay, offering more story focus and linear mission structures, especially the plot-relevant quests for the Divine Beasts. It's worth noting that even if you find a way to climb to a Divine Beast before you're supposed to, the game won't let you inside. It's one of the few times the game actually breaks its approach to freedom. Meanwhile, Impressionism is associated with the wild, where gameplay takes on a different style never before seen in the series, more focused on players' stories emerging from interconnected systems, almost like an immersive sim. To recap, this means the more traditional Zelda gameplay is accompanied by more traditional Zelda music, while the new Zelda gameplay is accompanied by a new musical style. That makes a lot of sense when you think about what towns represent within the world of Breath of the Wild. They are bastions of the civilization that survived the calamity. As such, they are like memories of what the past of Hyrule was. These style associations lend a narrative quality to the music. One of the most notorious examples is the Temple of Time song, usually a regal, sublime melody. Here being played by an extremely sparse and subdued piano is the perfect representation of a familiar location being overtaken by the wilderness. almost as a microcosm for Breath of the Wild itself, where familiar imagery and atmosphere is juxtaposed with new gameplay. The Terry Town side quest is another good example. In essence, it's this game's version of the traditional trading sequence found in a lot of previous Zelda games. It's not very interesting in terms of gameplay and highly linear, but it stands as one of the more memorable quests because of its endearing plot. The thing that makes it relevant to the game's music is how it becomes more and more melodic the more you advance through the quest by inviting new citizens to the town, each one adding an instrument from their place of origin. Once again, the romantic style is associated with traditional linear gameplay. But also worth noting, this side quest's theme is about rebuilding the former glory of Hyrule, so there's an association with rediscovering the past as well. One final example is the Guardian theme. The very first few notes of it resemble the initial notes of the main theme of Breath of the Wild. But here, the notes are sped up and lead to a relentless, repetitive tune, which fits well with the mechanical precision of the enemies. The interesting part is how the main theme is twisted into this version, which seems to represent Ganon's corruption. Much like the Temple of Time, this is another example of the Impressionist style breaking up a more traditional melodic tune, which is another way in which Breath of the Wild's relationship to its legacy is complicated. But I think nowhere is this made more evident in the game's soundtrack than in its final boss songs. The music for Hyrule Castle is an amalgam of multiple classic Zelda tunes that flow in and out of one another. While it is still not exactly the most hummable melody I can think of, it somehow manages to strike a balance between the romantic and impressionist styles of the game. Again, I'm not a music expert, but this song feels to me like an impressionist collage using pieces of romantic songs from the series' past. It's the duality of Breath of the Wild's quest to define its own identity coalescing into a singularity in the game's finale. This extends to the Dark Beast Ganon fight as well. It's a shame this battle is not more exciting from a gameplay standpoint, because the music is an absolutely insane mix of the game's main theme with Ganondorf's theme from Ocarina of Time, both of which have their more melodic sensibilities clash hard against a manic piano arrangement to really drive home everything we've talked about up until now. Past meets future, romantic meets impressionist, everything, everywhere, all at once. All of this bombastic, loud music stands in clear contrast to most of the game's experience, however. For most of it, the most prevalent sounds players will hear are the thuds of Link's footsteps, the clanking of his equipment, and the natural sounds of the wild. The empty space created by the wilderness's lack of music allows players to pay close attention to these sounds. Silence acts as a framing for nature, which is in many ways the star of the show during a lot of Breath of the Wild, arguably since its very inception. The very first glimpse we had into the world of Breath of the Wild paid homage to the beginning of Princess Mononoke by Studio Ghibli. As Link is chased down by a relentless, multi-legged pursuer, many fans couldn't help but be reminded of Ashitaka's confrontation with Nago. This wasn't the first time Zelda seems to have drawn inspiration from this movie, with Koroks in particular resembling the movie's rendition of Kodamas. But, nevertheless, by marking our introduction to the world of Breath of the Wild as a reference to Mononoke, Nintendo signaled our first hint at what some of the inspiration behind the new title would be. So I think it's important that we take a closer look at this movie and pinpoint any similarities between the two works to highlight what they can tell us about Breath of the Wild. If you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend you do so, it's amazing, but it won't be necessary for this video since this section won't contain any major spoilers. I'll be discussing some character traits and showing some relevant imagery, but I won't be touching anything like the movie's ending or the conclusion of any character arcs. With that out of the way, let's move on. I think it's fair to say that, at its core, Princess Mononoke is a movie about nature, and more specifically, about man's relationship to it. It is a movie that's muddled in the duality of this relationship. One character that perfectly embodies the grey morality of this world is Lady Eboshi, the ruler of Irontown. She's a caring leader that specifically looks after the downtrodden. Her people are comprised of former prostitutes, homeless, and lepers, but she's also an unwavering industrialist, stopping at nothing to secure the resources of the forest for her people to the detriment of all creatures living in it. On the other hand, the forest animals aren't portrayed in a rose-tinted light either. They can be stubborn, proud, and even terrifying at times. But they can also be affectionate, serene, and sublime. The movie portrays both how men mistreat nature and how nature can strike back, and in doing so, it advocates for a message of balance and equilibrium between the two. Men's relationship to nature is also a theme present in Breath of the Wild. More specifically, in its gameplay and the introduction of survival elements, along with the robust chemistry and physics system which allow the player to build their own solutions to the challenges presented by the environment. But we'll talk more about gameplay in a bit. Right now I want to focus on visuals, because one way Hayao Miyazaki's film handles the portrayal of nature is through the extensive use of establishing shots. They are distinct not only because of their abundance but also their duration. Miyazaki has a tendency as a director to linger on scenes that many would generally consider unimportant. In an interview, Roger Ebert referred to these as moments of gratuitous motion, and Miyazaki clarified that they have a word for these kinds of moments in Japanese, the word ma, basically meaning emptiness. The director illustrates it by clapping his hands and pointing out the time between claps as ma. Breath of the Wild's visuals are naturally very beautiful, as one would expect from a modern AAA effort, but one way it goes beyond just looking pretty is focusing on the spaces between. What I mean by that is that the game teaches you to look around for shrines, Korok seeds, and all sorts of points of interest, and in doing so, it inadvertently also trains you to take in your surroundings more attentively. It incentivizes the appreciation of its world and the nature that makes up such a large portion of it. It's interesting to note that Breath of the Wild is only the second game in the franchise that actually uses a second analog stick for the camera control in all of its versions at launch. The first one would be Wind Waker on the GameCube. Then came Twilight Princess, where Z-targeting was the only way to adjust the camera due to the lack of a second analog stick on the Wii. And the same is true for Skyward Sword. Nowadays, both of these titles have received remakes with second analog support, but I want to argue that Breath of the Wild is actually the first game that has gameplay actively designed around it, and this ends up having a profound impact on how players take in the visuals. Just try to imagine what exploring this vast Hyrule using only Z targeting as your means of controlling your point of view would feel like. Imagine climbing to the top of a mountain and having to reposition the character or go into first-person mode before being able to scope your surroundings. It may seem like a subtle change, but it would be a tremendous difference to the player experience. While the game certainly has its moments of grandiosity and spectacle, I would argue the focus on taking in the environment leads to a very introspective experience when venturing through the wilderness. The absence of a companion character for the first time in a 3D Zelda game seems to be a deliberate decision to enhance the player's introspection. This quietness is another way in which Breath of the Wild parallels Princess Mononoke. Apparently Miramax wanted to add sound effects to some of the scenes of the movie, deeming them too quiet for Western audiences. Like I mentioned earlier, Princess Mononoke is coded in duality. But one topic it seems to be decidedly against is the industrial exploitation of nature. Breath of the Wild, on the other hand, displays conflicting points of view on technology. The Guardians, for example, are the most menacing enemies in the game. They were built to be allies, but got easily corrupted into playing the opposite role. This may seem like Breath of the Wild lands firmly on the same side as Mononoke, but then we have other pieces of Sheikah technology, like the Sheikah Slate and the Temple of Resurrection, which play pivotal roles in saving Hyrule. Breath of the Wild displays technology as a tool. Whether it's used for good or ill depends on the user above all else. This ambiguity of the role of technology brings us back to the debate on how the game frames whether Zelda was right or wrong to focus on her research of the Sheikah tech. Hopefully, after going through all the ways in which Breath of the Wild is drenched in contrasting and conflicting ideas, it's more understandable why I feel the game gets a pass by not explicitly framing Zelda's research as the right path in detriment of her sealing powers. The game thrives in this uncomfortable position of not resolving the conflict between past and present. Ultimately, though, it's in the portrayal of nature that both Breath of the Wild and Princess Mononoke have the most in common. Both showcase a world that's beautiful and dangerous. The game is easily the hardest in the series since Zelda 2 on the NES, and this emphasizes the dangers of venturing into the wild. As much as the game prides itself on freedom, the overwhelming power of nature always forces players to adapt or suffer the consequences. Rain severely hampers your movement, thunderstorms disallow the use of metallic equipment, and the environment temperature forces you to wear appropriate clothing, sometimes in detriment of your defense stats. It's almost a gameplay representation of Mononoke's main message: humanity must find ways to coexist with nature or perish. One caveat in the case of Breath of the Wild, however, is its main villain. Nature is only half of the equation, the other half are the monsters spread throughout the map. This dangerous world is the world Calamity Ganon has created, but I find it interesting that arguably for the first time in the Zelda series, Ganon could be said to fall into the force of nature trope. These kinds of villains are usually faceless, mindless beings of enormous scale that represent some concept of reality. In this case, Zelda outright states Ganon has given up on reincarnating as a human and assumed a form of pure malice. When I say this is the world Calamity Ganon created, I think a good thought exercise that illustrates that point is imagining all the major structures that would still be standing across the map if it wasn't for its reappearance. Obviously, Hyrule Castle and Castle Town wouldn't be overrun, but we would also have Fort Hateno, Akala Fortress, the Temple of Time, the military training camp, not to mention all the small nameless ruins we come across during our travels through Hyrule. Nature may be dangerous and unforgiving, but it's made even more so by the vast stretches of land where no shelter can be found. The lethality of Breath of the Wild's world is used to highlight the duality of the human relationship to nature. The natural phenomena I described earlier as imposing against the player's freedom often also allows us to create clever solutions to beat enemies or overcome obstacles. The genius of the game lies in allowing players to leverage their freedom to forge their own path, and most importantly, their own identity. As I mentioned earlier, in his GDC talk, Fujibayashi stated his goal for Breath of the Wild was to have players experience true freedom. I think it's fair to say that he accomplished this goal. Breath of the Wild is relentless in its approach to freedom. In some ways, this is obvious. You can climb anything, you can do any dungeons you want in any order you want, and said dungeons offer equally open-ended puzzles. There are no dotted lines to waypoints, and in fact, the game expects you to set your own waypoints. Backstory cutscenes can be found in any order, or not at all. You can choose between upgrading stamina or health. The list goes on and on. More interesting, however, are the more unexpected or subtle ways in which this freedom comes up, particularly in relation to the series' best. Breath of the Wild is the first game you get to completely customize Link's appearance, for example, while in previous games any cosmetic change were usually tied to main quest progression. This is also the first time in a 3D Zelda where you can jump anytime you want, since previous games had an auto jump system when running up to ledges. And as I mentioned earlier, while other Zelda games in the past have allowed players to move the camera around with the right analog stick, this is the first game where this freedom of movement is not only a nice to have feature, but a necessity of gameplay given how the world exploration is set up. It might seem like a stretch, but one could even make the argument that Breath of the Wild even allows you to break the game for yourself, particularly in the way it handles healing. This is another common criticism of the game, that being able to heal in the pause menu allows players to cheese their way through tougher encounters, which I think is a fair criticism to level at the game. The counter-argument that you could just ignore health items during combat is something I would usually have a problem with, but in the context of Breath of the Wild, it's not hard to see it as another way in which the game allows you to play however you feel like. If you know about the waterfall shortcut in Hyrule Castle, which allows you to skip the best dungeon in the game almost entirely, then you already know the developers are not worried about letting you break the game for yourself if you so choose. Because the crucial aspect about all of this freedom is that it exists in service of something greater, finding your own identity. This is the link, pun absolutely intended, between the journey Zelda and Link go through respectively. In Zelda's story, we see her having to constantly struggle between what's expected of her and what she really wants to do. At that time, Link knew exactly the role he needed to play, but by the time we start the game, he lost his memories and doesn't really remember who he is. As we play through Breath of the Wild, there's enough freedom provided so that we can develop our own playstyle and consequently paint whatever colors we like onto the blank canvas that is Link. As mentioned earlier, even Link's backstory is completely optional, segmented, and laid out non-linearly, so even though his true canon identity in the game cannot be shaped by the player, it can be colored by the order in which they uncover it, if they uncover it at all. In an interview around the time of release for the game's DLC, Eiji Aonuma stated, "Since this game is part of the Zelda game series, some people may assume that you need to play the other games to understand it. However, Link starts this game without any memories, so it's a game where Link goes on a journey figuring out who he is and why he was asleep there. Because of this, players can enjoy the game without knowing anything about the past Zelda series games, and it's a game focused on discovering what the game is about." This statement extends beyond the game's narrative. The way its puzzles and combat systems are designed encourages experimentation through emergent gameplay. The player's journey of discovery through Hyrule mirrors Link's quest to remember who he is. Many players find joy in discovering new ways to get over obstacles and dispatch enemies, and the game accommodates this desire to test the limits of the mechanics available. These are the kinds of players that like to challenge themselves to do things like killing a moblin using a cuckoo, or defeating entire enemy camps using only the Sheikah Slate, or even bigger challenges like completing the game without climbing anything, or without ever getting the Sheikah rooms. On the other hand, there are players like me, who like to try to find the developer intent in the game's design. So more often than not, I like at least knowing what the quote-unquote intended solution is before deciding if I want to experiment with some other new way. These are two fundamentally different kinds of players, but Breath of the Wild's design manages to accommodate both. I say this because, while it is a game that throws you into its world where you can do whatever you want, it's not a world that lacks guidance and intent. For example, many have pointed out that the game clearly guides you towards completing Vah Ruta first, and from there it seems to me like the most logical progression is a sort of counterclockwise circle around the map before heading for Hyrule Castle at the center. The most obvious way in which the game guides the player is through the use of waypoints on the map and King Rhoam's guidance. But other more subtle signpostings in its world design are almost ever present, from the preference of triangular shapes for landmarks on the horizon, to the way the unnatural glow of the shrines catches a player's vision. One particularly nice touch is at the top of the Temple of Time, where two windows frame both goals given by the king: find Impa and defeat Ganon. Since going to Kakariko is the most obvious choice for a first-time player, the window that frames the dueling peaks has some wood planks for players to run off of, hinting more towards the short-term goal, even when ignoring everything the prior cutscene made explicit. This is where Breath of the Wild's approach to world design shines, and where I feel a lot of other open worlds fall short. It somehow offers complete freedom while keeping a firm guiding hand to accommodate all kinds of players. All of this speaks to the theme of finding your identity as a player, the same way Link is re-establishing his own throughout the adventure. The sheer number of Korok seeds and shrines is an example of how the game doesn't necessarily expect you to find everything. It expects that you will carve out your own path that is uniquely yours, different than most everybody else. Breath of the Wild is a sandbox where you're invited to discover yourself. How do you like to play? What does Zelda gameplay mean to you? In that spirit, I think it's worth highlighting the Eventide side quest as one that complements this theme. If we take the aforementioned counterclockwise circle around the map as the intended journey, this shrine comes up near the very end of the player's journey through Hyrule, and in that vein, it strips them away of all equipment and items, forcing players to rediscover and contrast those first few hours on the Great Plateau where they were still getting to grips with the game's mechanics and systems. Along the adventure, players inevitably pick up more than a few tricks and preferences that must be employed here to help their survival. No other segment in the game highlights the result of the player's journey quite as effectively as Eventide. In one of the cutscenes, Zelda mentions the Silent Princess flower is an endangered species that can only grow in the wild. It is an obvious metaphor for her character arc, which is about doing things her own way, and how she needed to be free to build her own identity. Here's where the game lays down the philosophy that permeates almost every aspect of its design, including its gameplay. Freedom is a tool of self-discovery. At its most basic level, it's easy to say Breath of the Wild is a game about freedom. Its design makes that abundantly clear. Where I think the game takes the concept further than initially apparent is in asking the question, freedom for what? The answer I hopefully managed to illustrate with this video is the theme of identity. It's not just about having the freedom to do whatever, but also the freedom to look at the past, the expectations it sets upon the future, and decide for yourself what to take away from this legacy and what to let go of. This seems to be true for the game's developers, for its characters, and I would argue for its players as well. In this process, the game stumbles upon a few contradictions, particularly in its portrayal of Zelda. But even that seems in line with the non-linear path of discovering your own identity while under the pressure of decades of expectations. Arguably, this examination isn't truly finished by the end of the game. We know Tears of the Kingdom is a direct sequel, and more likely than not, it will have to re-examine some of the choices made in Breath of the Wild that might have gone a bit too far in one particular direction. One big example would be the lack of traditional dungeons, which many fans missed in Breath of the Wild, myself included. As of this recording, there is no way to know, but time will surely tell. At the final cutscene, Zelda looks over her kingdom and states, "We can restore Hyrule to its former glory, perhaps even beyond." It's hard for me not to see this as a direct statement from the development team, and it's even harder not to be excited for what the future holds for this legendary franchise.